Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our live broadcast on a Wednesday at lunchtime. So this is my standard sort of 12 o'clock, let me talk to you. And once a month, I do a webinar at this time talking about usually something that we've been discussing in the last few weeks in these live sessions. And so that webinar will be next week, and it will be an expanded version of the thing that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is a concept that I got from Stuart Bartels from the Australian Institute of Police Management just recently. And I was interviewing him for my new book, that's The Trouble with Trauma at Work. And when we were having this discussion about, that interview in the book and what I was trying to achieve, one of the things that Stuart sort of said to me was some of their research had shown, and I think he said it came from Western Australian Police at the beginning, this concept of the leadership lottery, that the idea was that your outcomes in terms of your injury were really very dependent upon whether or not you had a good and supportive leader in the workplace. Now, that's actually a really important point, I think, to come back to, because I often talk to organizations about their management sort of mental health literacy, because we know there's quite a lot of research out that shows that if you have leaders in your organization, and what I want to say is more the middle management layer here, the ones that are the team leaders who are directly responsible for approving leave or, taking in the information about where a problem has occurred in the workplace, then they're the managers that we're talking about when we start talking about the leadership lottery. If somebody has an injury in the workplace, it's usually how that injury is managed by their direct supervisor that has the biggest impact prior to them actually lodging any kind of claim for workers' compensation. And then secondary to that, they have a bigger impact from usually from the organization's insurer. So once there's a workers' compensation claim that's approved, then the outcomes for that person tend to get even worse, unfortunately, because the interactions that they have tend to be quite negative and they don't tend to generally feel supported. So a big part of this, where I'm talking to organizations about preventing the injuries in the first place, is primarily because we don't want it to get to the point where somebody's then off on an extended period of workers' compensation leave, especially when we start talking about psychological injuries, because we know without a shadow of a doubt that the person who is out of the work environment, usually if it's more than about 3 weeks, the chance under some sort of stress or psychological injury that was initiated from something that happened in the workplace, the chances of ever getting them back into that workplace successfully are pretty slim. And those injuries often are the most protracted, and they cost the most amount of money. They are the longest kind of injury impacts in terms of the statistics. They cost the most, they cause the biggest sort of issues, and they ultimately result in the biggest harm. And so you might have seen this morning that I shared something that Brene Brown had actually shared on her LinkedIn, and I saw it and it seemed appropriate, about having a look at these 5 different areas that people talk about, because she's got a new thing in Dare to Lead, and she was actually discussing this fact that there is that 5 areas within an organization where people kind of talk about the problems that they might have. And I'm just going to read them out because this is actually off her post, and I reshared that post this morning. So when we talk about toxic workplace cultures, the 5 attributes that seem to poison corrupt culture, this is according to Brene Brown, in the eyes of the employees, is 1, being disrespectful, not being inclusive, that there's unethical behaviors or even a perception of it being unethical, that organizations have a tendency to have a very cutthroat culture, or that they can be quite abusive. Now, this is actually from a management review paper that was produced in the MIT Sloan Management Review, and Brene Brown shared it again this morning. Now, all of those things, when we talk about toxic workplace culture, sure, they're all going to come together to produce a level of toxicity. When I was interviewing Stuart Bartels last week, I was talking about how do we improve a toxic workplace culture, and he was talking very strongly about the impact of leadership and actually trying to build a much more compassionate leadership style, which can be very difficult to achieve in an organization where there are multiple layers of this negative or quite toxic culture. So a big part of organizational change, when you're talking about large organizations, really has to be something that is driven from the top and provided with a whole bunch of other supports. And I always talk about the sandwich, right? You've got to have the support, the drive at the top, and the accountability in that leadership model, and a set of processes at that lower level that means that there's an escalation process if something's not happening in the middle, right? So we sandwich it when we want to have big change, but we kind of have to have an external, I want you to think about it almost like an elevator. I always say to people, you know, like an elevator on a building site, when you've got a new building, you can't use the traditional stuff. They bring in this temporary elevator. And you want to be able to do that when you're trying to create a big organizational cultural change. You need an elevator to the top that says this actually isn't working because it's getting caught in the middle somewhere. So I'm not saying that you all going to be in these huge organizations, but actually where we see the biggest problems in terms of large numbers of people who are going off on psychological injury claims and these sorts of things do tend to be in larger organizations, because, you know, in smaller businesses, there's often a different kind of pressure, and there's not necessarily a perception of having this very big hierarchy opportunity for people to be able to progress up. And it's usually the opportunity to progress up in some sort of level of promotional scale that then tends to lead people to this idea of developing some of those negative or toxic workplace cultures. So, and, you know, we think about that, that makes perfect sense, right? That, you know, most places, if you think that, you know, there's only certain opportunities for you to kind of move yourself up and that other people are in the way, sometimes the way that we kind of operate as humans to make that happen, where we're the one that comes out on top, aren't always necessarily the nicest things that we might do if we were truly being a supportive human being to our fellow human beings, right? So sort of putting that to one side for a minute, one of the things that we know about that middle part, so if you stop and think about the example that I use, that sandwich, the bits in the middle of the sandwich that do have the direct responsibility for the people on the ground who might be exposed to problems, it's them that usually have the greatest impact on whether or not you're going to have a big problem within the organization. And you might recall a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about why senior leaders really need to have a handle on, you know, what's going on in terms of their injuries in their workplace. Because, you know, you just get an annual report that says, oh, we had this many people off for this length of time and it cost us this much money. You're not getting any insight into whether or not there's a problem within a certain area of the organization. And you really need to be able to know where you've got a problem kind of bubbling away. And, you know, I was talking, when I was interviewing Stuart Bartels, I was talking about an interview that I'd done with somebody who'd had a workplace problem. And, you know, there seemed to be a specific area within this organization that, you know, somehow there was no view from the top that actually this was quite a toxic little environment. And that a lot of people, because it was sort of, as part of the organization, it was a little bit out on its own. It seemed to, you know, be a place that people kind of went to when they were having issues or somebody felt that they had issues. And so it's like the little side park that we send people to. When we have those areas within the organization, what we're doing is actually then setting up these sort of areas in which to perpetuate these ongoing problems without ever resolving them. And often, you know, where they're sitting in under the view, like the senior people at the top who really want to make change, I find, often the ones talking about, we've really got to improve this, make it better. And what they get from underneath them is, yeah, we've got this framework in place, we've got these things happening, but actually there's no accountability for the rollout or the outcomes that we're looking for as a result of that framework being put in place. So I even said this to Stuart when I was interviewing him. So how do you know that leaders who go through your program actually end up improving their leadership in terms of their level of compassion? How do we test that? And his response to that was, oh, they do it over a long period of time. They do a lot of, self-reflection, examination, all of that sort of stuff. And I'm going, okay, I get all of it. And I know it sounds really positive, and it's a great, they work on a Harvard model. I'm not criticizing the model at all. But it was like, once they've graduated from that program, how do we know that within the organization, then this person's leadership or the way that they approach their people has improved? Right? Because we're not actually necessarily getting any 360-degree feedback. We're not actually assessing whether or not the organization's leadership are taking ownership or responsibility for improving the outcomes, especially in a mental health space, of their people. We're not actually looking at the numbers of workers' compensation claims going up and making somebody responsible in their KPIs for that actually happening. We've almost stepped back and just let it be. It's just part of one of those things that we can't control. And it's actually not true that we can't control it. There are so many things that we can do in terms of preventing psychological injuries in the workplace just by changing the way that we approach people. So the mental health literacy of that middle management team is absolutely essential to understanding how then we can apply, certain policies and procedures and approaches. And they have to also be given a sideways move so that if they're not getting what they need from the person that they have to, basically be reporting to for whatever reason, that there is a sideways independent assessment of where that problem has kind of, come up, and actually something that can change it. So if I go back to this example in the organization, recently there's been things, so the policy around who approves leave and how all of those things kind of happen sits within the work unit, but the work unit are not actually acting in compliance with their HR policies and procedures. Now, when that happens, we've got this double layer problem, and HR will, when it gets escalated, and this is an ongoing problem that gets escalated, the work area just kind of go, oh, oh no, well, we didn't do it, or we don't agree with it, or whatever. So the decision making about whether or not this person is actually able to access an entitlement sits within the work area, but the HR area are the ones who own the policy that says what that person can or can't have. Now, sometimes, particularly in large organizations, they end up disagreeing. But if the HR area only owns the policy, they can't approve the access to, whatever entitlement that is, then we've got another problem, right? So this is one of the things that I often say to organizations, especially very hierarchical ones, do a lot of work in that emergency services sort of front first responder area. One of the problems is the more hierarchical an organization is, the more structured their HR policies and procedures tend to be, and the ownership of the, people management is usually kept to within a specific work area, and that it's that manager who has responsibility to, approve or allow things to happen. And that sometimes if that person just holds fast to something that they believe in, whether it's right or wrong, they cause more of a problem. And a lot of the thing with interpretation of HR policies and procedures comes into this as well. We have to make them really very clear, and there has to be an override process. So it can't just be the decision of one person, and it can't just be the decision of one person in complete sort of, absence of involvement of HR to veto or override it. So there's a bunch of things in this, and you may have ideas in your organization about where some of these problems actually sit. But until you can actually start to see if you're the senior manager and you're looking at this organization as a whole, if you just get the feedback and the reports from your immediate subordinates kind of telling you everything's hunky-dory, and then you get the annual report at the end of the year that says, hey, we had all of these people who went off on, long-term kind of workers' comp injuries, what's going on there? I have very few leaders when I'm asked to help out an organization, very few leaders ever turn around and say to me that they know what those statistics are, where they came from, and why they still exist. And it is one of those things that I think We have to, often as leaders, especially in the business sector, you've focused on the profitability and all of these, the service delivery, all of these different elements that you've got to kind of focus on to make sure the business happens. And we trust, or we entrust the care of our people to the HR area and assume that it's all going well. But nobody tends to ask the right questions. So just because you have never asked the question about your workers' comp claims and injury areas and asked to look at those aggregated data sort of bits of information and start to see a pattern, then please don't assume that there is no problem. And don't wait until your annual review before you start to realize that it's actually costing your organization a lot of money, right? And the prevention of injuries, even in those emergency services, frontline sectors that we know that the role itself can expose people to more stress, we can still prevent them from developing injuries in the workplace. We just have to take a different approach. All right, so I hope that was useful. Next week, where I'm actually going to expand on this in more detail. So if you're interested in coming along to that webinar, same time next week, please just register with the link below. You'll be able to sort of see it underneath. Then there'll be another promo probably coming out to people about our webinar next week. So look out for that one, and you should find it reasonably interesting. If there's anything in specific that you want me to talk about in that webinar, please also put comments below this post so that we can pick up on that for next week. All right, I hope that helped, and I will see you soon.